Welcome to The Deep Dive. I'm your host, ready to explore some really interesting territory today.
And I'm your guide. We're about to dive into a stack of sources that give a really compelling and sometimes uncomfortable look at the history of class in America.
Right.
We're focusing particularly on how that concept, often labeled white trash, has, evolved over time. And just to be clear, our material comes only from excerpts from a specific book you've shared, and we're sticking strictly to what's in these pages.
Okay, got it. So our mission today is to unpack this deep, sometimes difficult history of class in America exactly as it's presented in these specific source texts. We're aiming for a detailed, almost academic analysis, looking at the insights, the surprising facts these texts lay out. We want to understand the long story of this specific class identity, how it was perceived, defined, redefined, all based only on the information provided here.
Exactly.
Let's see what this deep dive into your sources reveals about America's less told class history.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning, the colonial period. The sources make a pretty strong case right away. Class wasn't some minor thing that just popped up later, with factories or big waves of immigration.
No, it was there from the start.
Profoundly present, according to these texts, deeply rooted in how English society already defined poverty.
And the language they used back then, even before crossing the Atlantic, it's really something, isn't it? The sources list terms like thriftless, idle.
Yeah, and worse, describing the poor as diseased, dangerously mobile, even comparing them to swarms of insects.
Insects, wow.
Yeah, an overflowing multitude, and a fluvial current like pollution, a literal plague of poverty.
So it wasn't just about lacking money, it was seen as some kind of moral or even biological failing.
That's the core insight the texts present. Poverty was pathologized, seen almost like a disease contaminating the social body, and this view directly shaped the plans for the American colonies.
How did that work?
Well, the sources explain that colonies like Virginia, Jamestown specifically, were actually conceived as a solution to this problem in England.
The solution.
The idea was to purge, or excrete this human waste from England. The language is incredibly stark, calling colonies emunctories, like drains, or referring to the poor being sent over as the offals of our people.
So less land of opportunity, more. Designated dumping ground for some?
That's precisely the picture these sources paint.
Yeah.
And the reality in Jamestown, the labor system, it mirrored that view entirely.
Indentured servitude.
Right. Which, as described here, basically made laborers into disposable property.
Disposable.
They were in such a harsh environment, often brutal, that people were quite literally worked to death. The texts highlight young men and boys being especially vulnerable.
And it wasn't set up for them to succeed, was it? The sources say it was incredibly hard for servants to, start families, get land.
Exactly. A huge contrast to the big planters who were grabbing land and power.
So the servants were stuck.
Yeah, pretty much reduced to debt slaves, the texts say. Very little legal protection. Their only real liberty, quote unquote, was to run away, which was obviously risky.
So Jamestown didn't create some ideal English village.
Far from it. According to these sources, it just reproduced and maybe even intensified a ruthless class order.
And the sources connect this directly to the rise of slavery, don't they? This system of treating people as commodities.
That's a critical link the texts make, yeah. The harsh conditions, treating indentured servants like assets, even a strategy mentioned to sort of breed children for future labor.
Wow.
These things, described in the context of indentured servitude, are presented as key precursors that sort of paved the way for chattel slavery. It wasn't a sudden switch, but an evolution from an already brutal, class-based system.
Okay, shifting focus a bit geographically, the sources also talk about North Carolina playing a key role early on.
Yes, Poor Carolina it's called, seen as a swampy refuge for the poor and landless.
A refuge, but not in a good way.
Not according to the descriptions here. A troublesome sink of America. Populated by people dismissed as useless lubbers, which apparently means sleepy, oafish men.
Lubbers, okay.
The sources are pretty blunt, calling it the first white trash colony.
That's direct language from the source material. And you mentioned William Byrd's observations.
Right. His accounts, as relayed here, really paint a picture. He describes meeting a family, the Keiths, living in something more like a cattle pen than a house. No proper roof, sleeping in a fodder stack outside.
Grim.
But here's the key insight the sources pull from Byrd. His reaction wasn't really pity, it was scorn.
Scorn.
Yeah, he was contemptuous that they showed not the least sense of shame about how they lived. It highlights how class wasn't just about money, but about judgment from the outside, about perceived social
And
failings.
this is when terms like squatter and cracker start appearing in America.
That's what the sources indicate. They weren't totally new ideas, but American versions rooted in older English notions of, vagrancy and idleness, a squatter being someone illegally on land. There's a reference to a 1788 letter about squatters in Maine being afraid of getting caught.
So that whole romantic image of the frontier, endless opportunity, anyone can make it, these sources seem to challenge that pretty hard.
Absolutely. They argue social mobility was way more limited than the legends suggest. A predictable class structure popped up fast.
Like what?
You had speculators and big farmers on top, then middling landowners who maybe had connections, then less secure small farmers, and finally the texts mention artisans of the meaner sort near towns.
And by the 1830s, these negative views started turning into actual physical descriptions, caricatures.
Yes, the sources cite people like Alexander Wilson, the ornithologist, viewing squatters almost like a different species, a curious species, in grotesque log cabins. And the texts list common descriptions. A telltale gait, being lantern-jawed, double-jointed, or gaunt, long-limbed, having a swarthy complexion, often being toothless. These weren't just observations, they were markers used to define and separate a lower class.
And the Davy Crockett story fits into this, how he was sort of packaged.
It's a fascinating example in the sources. They show how the real person got overshadowed by this caricature created by hack biographers,
It's a caricature.
turning him into an ill-educated braggart, a wild man, emphasizing his supposedly savage instincts. It shows how real people from this background could be turned into symbols, often negative ones, for mass consumption.
So even as the U.S. is founded on these ideals of equality, this underlying class structure, and these negative views of poor whites just continued.
That's the argument in the sources, yes, that the founding story often gets whitewashed. We focus on the pilgrims or myths of mobility, but the deep class divisions are obscured.
And it's ironic, the sources point out the rise of things like genealogical societies in the 19th century, tracing lineage back to early settlers.
Right, creating a kind of democratic royalty, as the text puts it, reinforcing inherited status even in a republic.
What about someone like Thomas Paine? His common sense is famous for attacking monarchy.
And the sources acknowledge that, but they also note it kind of obscured other injustices. By framing class mostly through continental races and commercial impulses, it effectively left out the ignoble waste people, the convict laborers, the servants, the working poor. They weren't really part of his revolutionary picture.
Let's dig into Thomas Jefferson then. Based only on these texts, his views seem complex. He's tied to the agrarian ideal.
They show he was aware of the less enlightened reality behind that ideal, though. The struggling farmers, the badly run plantations. He made a big distinction, according to the text,
Between whom?
between slaves, who he called tillers, and free white farmers, the cultivators or husbandmen. He believed only the latter group had substantial and genuine virtue.
So the independent yeoman farmer was his ideal. But he knew there were poor whites who didn't fit that mold.
Exactly, and the sources suggest he thought they could be improved, maybe, like land could be improved, through education, land ownership, hoping good habits would follow.
What?
But the text also points squarely at his profound class biases, conscious or not. And they mention how the ruling gentry often actively blocked efforts to actually help the poor rise up.
And the laws passed during his time reflected that tension.
Seems so, based on the sources. An education reform bill failed, but a bill funding workhouses passed.
Workhouses?
Yeah, punishing idle and dissolute courses, calling loiterers vagabonds. Poor kids could be apprenticed out. Even removing identifying badges for the poor didn't change the fundamentally punitive approach described here.
The sources also bring up Jefferson engaging with scientific debates about degeneration.
He did. He argued against theories like Buffon's swamp monsters, the idea that the American environment made things degenerate. Jefferson pointed to America's sublime nature, noble Native Americans, in his view, impressive fossils like mammoth bones.
To prove America was regenerative, not degenerative.
Exactly, but the sources raise a key question they say Jefferson never really answered.
Which is?
What about the people not in the talented elite? The masses at the bottom, the concourse of breeders, as one source puts it. The underlying idea, the text suggests, was that rubbish produced more rubbish, and maybe only a few could be salvaged.
And he used the word strata himself.
He did, in a letter, describing Virginia's social order as layers, shading imperceptibly from top to bottom, acknowledging a stratified, somewhat fixed system.
That idea of fixed layers, inherent qualities,
Okay.
it leads us right into the mid-19th century and the rise of biological determinism, doesn't it?
The sources mark that as a major shift, yes. Ideas about biological determinism and America's imperial destiny got tangled up with notions of racial superiority.
And a key part was this idea that Anglo-Saxons needed to basically outbreed everyone else
Mm.
based on an inherent sturdy quality.
What's really disturbing reading these texts is how explicitly this got linked to animal breeding.
Animal breeding.
Yeah. The sources cite figures like Alexander Walker, Orson Squire Fowler, who argued for applying horse breeding principles focusing on pedigree to human marriage for hygienic results.
So pedigree changed meaning, not just family name, but actual biology.
Precisely. It became about having healthy, long-lived ancestors, a sound constitution, free from hereditary disease or bad blood. The sources stressed the focus was guarding against contamination, avoiding the ill-born.
And after the Civil War, this thinking gets applied specifically to poor Southern whites.
Very much so, according to the text. The Republican critique of the South linked the depleted soil to the condition of poor whites often stuck on that land, calling them sandhillers, pineys.
Seen as part of the decay.
Exactly. As a degenerate population producing dwarfed people and animals, the sources even cite Thoreau's incredibly dark image of the South as a rotting corpse used to manure the West, basically equating poor whites with human detritus.
Even writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe in her novel Dread mentioned here apparently divided poor whites up, suggesting some with good blood could be saved.
And this concept of biological pedigree, the sources argue, reached the very top of the Supreme Court in Chief Justice Taney's Dred Scott decision.
How so?
The texts argue Taney essentially made pedigree a constitutional principle, saying only free white descendants of the founders were true heirs to citizenship, defined by bloodline and racial stock. It's framed as rejecting democracy for a classification by recognizable breeds.
Wow. Yet the sources also mention the Union Army kind of understood these class divisions in the South.
They did. Figures like Grant apparently believed the war would liberate poor whites too, the ones the planters called poor white trash, feeling they'd been manipulated. Grant's quoted saying, they too needed emancipation.
But then Reconstruction saw pseudoscience used to reinforce these hierarchies again.
Yes, the texts describe misusing survival of the fittest to make class and race differences seem natural. Tensions between poor whites and newly freed slaves were framed through ideas of unnatural brooding and competing degenerate stocks.
There was even a study.
An 1869 U.S. Sanitary Commission study mentioned in the sources. It apparently raised the question of comparing poor whites described as having degenerated into an idle, ignorant, degraded state with black men to see if intelligence was racially inherited.
And Theodore Roosevelt's views, as presented here.
Complex and troubling, seeing Southern white men as having taken a wrong turn on the evolutionary ladder, having unhealthy traits, contributing very, very little, valuing hardworking black men more theoretically, though the sources note he didn't actually protect their rights.
This all seems to lead directly to the eugenics movement.
Absolutely. The sources detail its horrifying goals. Culling bloodlines, segregating the unfit, forcibly sterilizing diseased and degenerate classes.
Sterilizing.
Yes, widespread laws by 1931, covering broad categories of unfit. There were even proposals mentioned here to kill the unfit, calls to stamp out the unemployable, prevent them from propagating their kind.
And poor women were a particular focus.
The sources really emphasize this. Seen primarily as breeders, carriers of degenerate germ protoplasm, the invention of the term moron in 1910 heightened fears about female morons passing as normal and contaminating the gene pool.
Even World War I policies were influenced by this.
The texts connect things like refusing soldiers prophylactics or rounding up prostitutes as tainted women, and even draft arguments worrying a volunteer army left the inferior mold home to beget the next race back to eugenic thinking.
And Virginia pops up again as a sort of test case.
A study called Mongrel Virginians is highlighted. It looked at the Wynn tribe, linking their supposed congenital ignorance to the perceived licentiousness of mixed-race women, whose breeding habits were described appallingly as almost that of an animal.
This idea of biological taint persisted in culture.
Yeah.
The novel Swamp Water
Uses an example in the sources, yeah. The idea that degenerate blood could physically manifest in children, even leading to thoughts of infanticide within the story's narrative.
Okay, Moving into the 20th century, the Great Depression. This seems like a moment where these ideas of waste became unavoidable.
Devastatingly so. The sources talk about it as a time of wasted lives, wasted land, human waste. It showed everyone that downward mobility was real, making poverty visible everywhere.
Because the scale was just so huge. Hoovervilles, shantytowns.
Exactly. You couldn't just dismiss the poor as isolated outcasts or hobos anymore. They were everywhere.
Margaret Brooke White's famous photo is mentioned.
Yes, presented in the sources as a really powerful symbol. Poor people in line for relief, right below a billboard showing the idealized middle-class American way, snarkily showing the grand illusion of equal opportunity. The sources note it was published alongside photos of black men on chain gangs, adding another layer.
And Henry Wallace, FDR's ag secretary, connected environmental and human waste.
He saw the closing frontier, the soil eroding, as symbolizing the washing away of different classes of people, driven like particles of dust. Lange's photo book, An American Exodus, is cited as capturing this.
Poor whites became really visible during this time, didn't they?
Very much so, in the media accounts described here. The Bonus Army's camps in D.C., seen as modern squatter shacks. Southern tenant farmers portrayed as this mobile, transient workforce. And of course, the huge focus on migrating Okies and Arkies.
The Grapes of Wrath image.
Right. Called rubber tramps, shanty towns on wheels, in sources like Woody Guthrie lyrics or the Steinbeckford adaptations mentioned.
And the tenant system itself was designed to keep people down.
The sources detail how landowners often wanted tenants dependent. The quote mentioned is, "A hungry worker was the best worker, relying heavily on child and female labor."
The New Deal tried some things, like the subsistence homestead programs.
According to the sources, partly, yeah, an attempt to show poor whites were completely normal people helped them overcome feeling like just trash.
But the sources are critical of whether that was enough.
Right. Figures like Daniels, Odom, Agee, mentioned in the texts, felt it was too small scale, that you needed something grander, like the TVA, to actually rearrange class structure. They point to examples like the Penderley homestead, where residents resisted the imposed middle-class rules.
So the forgotten man and woman wasn't really forgotten.
No, the problem wasn't ignoring them, the sources argue. It was the refusal to see them as one of us, an American.
And this links to bigger debates about the economy.
Absolutely. The sources mention critiques like John Corbyn's "How can you have national freedom with so much poverty?" There was a growing call for regulation, a readjustment, to fix market abuses and class imbalance, contrasting FDR's goal of protecting individualism with the obvious failure of laissez-faire, the dark hand of the unregulated economy creating all this misery.
Okay, so bringing us closer to the present. These class dynamics keep showing up in culture.
The sources talk about the cult of the country boy, Elvis, Andy Griffith, LBJ. Elvis apparently called himself a self-confessed raw country boy.
And Lyndon Johnson is presented as a key figure navigating this.
He worked hard, the texts say, to shed his southern backwater identity for the national stage. But he also made rural poverty, especially in Appalachia, a focus of his great society.
Connecting policy to his own background.
The sources suggest that link, yeah, with things like the Appalachian Act, Medicare, though they also note it wasn't nearly enough for the massive devastation. And he consciously tried to seem relatable, like those Age Evans photos from the 30s.
And pop culture definitely played on class. The Beverly Hillbillies.
Mentioned explicitly in the sources as cashing in on American extreme class consciousness, framing it as snobs versus slobs, which the texts argue kind of hid the real class conflict behind jokes.
Even the suburbs played a role in sorting people by class.
Places like Levittown, yeah. Helped by things like VA mortgages, they created one-class communities. And the sources point out that even then, people used language like stock and breed to describe class differences, birds of a feather flocking together.
Trailer parks also became a symbol.
A really loaded one, according to the texts. Seen as modern, but also anti-modern. Linked to slums, people on the way out, not up. Associated here with immigrant workers, retirees, the poor, and carrying those older echoes of immorality. Trailer nomadism.
And the redneck in movies, presented as complex.
Kind of a double edge based on the sources. Sometimes the villain embodying stereotypes. Other times a figure of freedom, unrepressed, contrasting with suburban conformity. Think man in the gray flannel suit versus maybe James Dean or Elvis as unreformed Americans, planting a wild seed.
While lots of country boy politicians succeeded regionally.
LBJ was the rare one, the text note, who made it all the way from that background to the White House. Figures like Davis, Taylor, O'Daniel mentioned here had more localized success.
Then, by the late 80s, the sources say white trash started being seen differently.
Yeah, sometimes reclaimed as an ethnic identity with its own cultural markers, viewed less as a fixed biological breed, maybe, and more as a kind of cultural breeding you could adopt or shed.
But the negative side persisted.
Oh, yeah. Including associations with sexual deviance, like indeliverance, mentioned here, and class hostility definitely remained.
How so?
The sources describe some upwardly mobile Southerners drawing really sharp lines between themselves and the weak, lazy, good-for-nothing ones. Blaming the poor for their situation, maybe forgetting the federal help they might have received, pulling up the ladder, essentially.
Tammy Faye Baker is used as an
As
example.
an exaggerated white trash image, yeah. Someone who rejected middle-class norms, embraced a garish self. The texts say this made her loved by poor fans but unredeemable to middle America, showing how class presentations still matter hugely.
And the label redneck itself could be policed.
The sources give examples of journalists basically disqualifying people like Newt Gingrich or David Duke from being called redneck, not based on politics, but on origin, accent, job, appearance, deciding who was authentically kin to that breed.
Fiction continued to explore these themes.
Carolyn Schutz's novel Beans is cited, depicting modern waste people, women as breeders, anxieties about bean blood, expressions of contempt, echoing those historical ideas. Though the sources also note Schutt later embraced redneck for working-class populism, seeing a widening class divide.
Even presidential politics engaged with this. Bill Clinton.
His narrative, as analyzed here, blended overcoming humble roots, boy from a small town in Arkansas, no money, no connections, difficult childhood, violent stepfather with internalizing white trash shame.
And the Monica Lewinsky scandal is framed in class terms in these sources.
As a kind of white trash outing on the grand national stage, yeah. Media portrayals described here cast Clinton like a Tennessee Williams character in a tawdry sexual escapade suited to a trailer park. The investigation itself focusing in part on trashy detail, using those stereotypes.
And more recently, Sarah Palin.
The sources point to the media focus on her daughter's pregnancy, the shotgun engagement, headlines like babies, lies, and scandal. Comparisons to Eliza Doolittle highlighting questionable class origins. Linking her to reality TV, calling her a white trash Barbie. Visually okay, but culturally disruptive.
And finally, reality TV itself, like Honey Boo Boo.
Presented in the sources as showing the new face of white trash, focusing on Mama June's weight, relationships, the deep poverty of her town, McIntyre, Georgia, emphasizing single-mother households, low-income politics, a modern image rooted in those centuries-old perceptions. So, when you pull all these threads together from the sources, the main argument they're making is pretty clear. Class separation, it's not minor, it's not new, it's a persistent central feature of American life and politics, even when there are constant efforts to hide it, deny it, or just talk around it.
And that incredible list of names the sources compile really drives it home. Waste people, off-scourings, lubbers, bog-trotters, raxels, rubbish, squatters, crackers.
Keep going. Clay eaters, tackies, mudsills, scalawags, briar hoppers, hillbillies, lowdowners, white niggers, degenerates, white trash, rednecks, trailer trash, swamp people.
It's relentless. It just shows the depth and the continuity of that negative perception over centuries.
It really hammers home the source's conclusion that our understanding of this history today is often narrow and skewed. That class, based purely on this material, has always been a fundamental defining thing in America, even if it's often untold or twisted.
Wow. That was a truly comprehensive and, sometimes difficult deep dive, sticking just to the sources you brought.
It really was. These texts, when you lay them out like this, reveal this deep 400-year history focused on the white poor in America, marked by just persistent negative views, exploitation, and constant attempts to obscure the reality of inequality behind myths and, frankly, damaging caricatures.
It certainly makes you question some common assumptions. As you, the listener, think about this long history presented in these texts, consider how it might inform your own understanding of class, identity, social mobility in America now. This history, straight from these sources, it challenges the easy stories, doesn't it?
It prompts deeper questions about who gets seen, who gets forgotten, and why.
So a final thought to leave you with, drawn from this analysis. Given this continuous effort across centuries documented right here in these texts to redefine, caricature, or just ignore a persistent poor white underclass, what does that suggest about the ongoing challenges of even acknowledging, let alone addressing, class inequality in America today.
Is the American dream, as we often hear it, maybe more profoundly shaped by this historical reality of embedded class divisions described in these sources than we're usually willing to admit? Something to think about.